Hi, my name is Jonathan Clancy, and I'm a senior business management major. I am the group leader for GAP Inc., our senior capstone class project. With the work of myself, along with team members Darren Marison, Thomas Bankelman, and Thomas Anderson, we were able to complete 8 workbooks that went into the depths of the company, researching things as simple as the company background to internal and external factor analyses. We were assigned GAP because, much like other brick-and-mortar retail stores, it is a failing business from an economic standpoint to a socio-cultural standpoint. Throughout the months of working on this project, our group created SWOT analyses, Porter analyses, and eventually strategies that we would suggest to the company's board of directors in an attempt to help the company in any way possible. Gap is a massive clothing retailer and owns a major part of the market share of this industry, due in large part to their subsidiaries like Old Navy and Banana Republic, who help in earning additional revenue. Gap was originally founded in 1969 by husband and wife Donald and Doris Fisher. Over the course of this video, I'll be showing you how our group was able to communicate and successfully complete our capstone project in the midst of a global pandemic. The coronavirus has not made it easy for our group to communicate in the ways in which we would prefer, but with a lot of adaptation and strong work ethics, we were able to get this project done to the best of our abilities. The first way in which our group communicated was through Zoom. Zoom is a lot like Skype, where you can video chat with your group partners. Throughout Zoom, you can either create a new meeting in which you can get your group all together at a specific time. You can join into a meeting that might have already existed at some point. You can schedule a meeting, such as if you wanted your group to meet at a specific date and time, you could schedule it then. And another very important step was that you could screen share while on Zoom. So if you had to show your group something on your screen specifically, you could do that through screen share. Zoom was our first very important tool that we used to communicate as a group. The video chats and being able to see each other do work and being able to see what each other was doing was vitally important to our success as a group. The second way in which we communicated was through Google Drive. Google Drive allowed us all to be able to work on documents at the exact same time all together and be able to see the work that was being done on these individual documents, much like we did with Zoom. Throughout Google Drive, we went from GAP Part 1 to GAP Part 8, all on the same drive. To start with GAP Part 1, as stated earlier, this was mostly a company background, as well as it stemmed into the first parts of a macro environmental analysis. What Dr. Palmer stressed was vitally important was a lot of our resources and a lot of the documents that we were able to find over the course of researching all of the individual parts, 1 through 8. We found many articles and many resources that helped us to configure things from company background to IFEs and EFEs. Eventually, towards the end, we came to a conclusion of ranks of what was hurting the company the most, what was the biggest issue. Technology, demographics, economic, lots of stuff like that. That was one of the biggest parts of our GAP Part 1 that we had to do. Stemming into GAP Part 2, this was a competitive analysis. Now, because GAP is in the retail industry, it has many competitors, as well as many substitutes. Again, stressing the importance of all the resources and all the articles that we found, this made it very easy for our group at the end of each part to conclude all of the information that we had learned. At the end of Part 2, we were able to rank the rivals and the substitutes and why they were ranked at that specific spot. In this case, we ranked Macy's, Kohl's, and H&M, companies like that are direct rivals of Gap, as the most vitally important rivals and or substitutes in the competitive analysis perspective. Now stemming into Gap Part 3. This was just an industry overview of the entire retail industry itself. Again, going through all of the individual resources that we have found, we were able to conclude lots of important things about the industry as a whole. So for this instance, we were able to conclude things that were important trend-wise in the industry. It's always important to keep up on trends. So some of the trends that we found to be most important when going through the industry overview that Gap had to keep into consideration were things like tailored clothing options, returns and exchange, keeping a green society, keeping up to date on their social media, lots of stuff like that. So it was important as an industry overview for Gap to be able to recognize trends that are big into the industry and be a part of that. The Porter analysis was what all Gap Part 4 was all about. So a Porter analysis includes such things as threats of new entries, buyer power, supplier power, threat of substitutes, and competitive rivalry. After Thomas Bankelman, Thomas Anderson, Darian, and myself found all the resources and all the articles, we were able to conclude lots of different ranks based on rivals and substitutes, as well as assess the overall powers of things like rivals, substitutes, new entrants, suppliers, and buyers, as stated previously, are the 5 parts of the Porter analysis. And then to conclude, we were able to rank what force of the Porter analysis was most crucial to Gap. What Gap had to conquer the most. In this case was the power of buyers. For Gap Part 5, we started our first part of the internal analysis. Again, as you can see, we found many different resources, many different articles as a group that were able to help in our conclusion. Thomas Anderson was a great help in being able to figure out all the firms' comparison of ratios, different things that would help financially for Gap. We figured out a lot of strengths and weaknesses. And finally, as a conclusion, as a strength and weakness, we found that one of the biggest strengths was the sub-companies. As stated previously, Old Navy and Banana Republic, companies like that, were very crucial to a strength that Gap had. A couple of weaknesses were stated below as well, but the first part of the internal analysis let us stem into that. Going into Part 6 was our EFE, or External Factor Evaluation. So this was Part 6 of our Gap project. A lot of our conclusions at the end of this, from an external standpoint, were opportunities and threats. Opportunities and threats are the biggest parts of external. Strengths and weaknesses are the biggest parts of an internal. So in this case, we were able to figure out a lot of the opportunities and threats, and whether they came from the Porter analysis or the macro environmental analysis. And then finally, at a conclusion, we were able to weight them and rate the opportunities and threats based on a different scale, figure out what was most important for Gap. For Part 7, now we're into our IFE, our internal factor analysis. After finding lots of resources and articles, our group was able to do the same thing that we did with the EFE, with the rating and weight scale. We were able to figure out our strengths and our biggest weaknesses for Gap. What are our best strengths and what are our best weaknesses, and how are they weighted? And then finally, we were able to compare the IFE and the EFE together and figure out expanded discussions and conclusions on what we found to be the most important threats, the most important strengths, things like that. Each individual person, Thomas Anderson, Thomas Bankelman, Darian, and myself were all able to figure that out. And finally, Part 8 was our SWOT analysis, which is what it all led up to. As stated previously, this is where we tried to suggestions as a group to the board of directors of what could help. We compared strengths and opportunities together. We compared strengths and threats, weaknesses and opportunities, and weaknesses and threats in order to minimize or maximize some of those for Gap itself. And again, as stated previously, we then took those and made them into strategies that we were able to discuss with the board of directors if it ever came to that point. And those are Gap's Part 1 through 8. Again, using the communication tools of Google Drive and Zoom, we were able to properly communicate as a group as best as possible and get all of our work done very successfully.